societies in New Guinea have been interacting with their natural resources for thousands of years, literally. And it's just an extraordinary place for a biologist and for people interested in cultural heritage. And I think the time is now for us to support any conservation actions that are aligned with Indigenous people's views, so that we can not see this as something that was lost, but as something that we have contributed to preserve in the long term.
New Guinea could be described as the last vestige of expansive, remote tropical rainforest in the world. It is the second largest island on the planet and the most floralistically diverse. Making up less than 0.5% of the world's landmass, it is estimated to contain as much as 10% of its global biodiversity. With over 13,000 endemic plant species, experts are still discovering more every single year. Much of the landscape is mountainous and difficult to traverse, which presents challenges both to conservation and also development. This is in part why over 80% of the island's forest cover still remains intact. However, experts are worried that giant road projects, massive palm oil plantations, and other extractive industries threaten not just the one-of-a-kind biological diversity of this island, like the enigmatic birds of paradise, but the vast human knowledge, culture, and livelihood of its original inhabitants, which represent well over 1,000 different languages across the island. I'm Mike DiGirolamo, your host for Mongabay Explores, an episodic podcast series from Mongabay.com's global team, where I speak with experts, scientists, and activists from the field working to protect our natural world. Join me for this introductory episode of our new season featuring the island of New Guinea. There's a saying in the palm oil sector: Sumatra was yesterday, Borneo is today, Papua is tomorrow, meaning that agribusiness conglomerates and developers in Indonesia and elsewhere in the world have their eyes on this region. Indeed, many projects have already been underway here for years, but there is great potential for this island to grant customary land rights for its Indonesian inhabitants, protect the ones in the Papua New Guinea side, and build economies based on sustainable commodities rather than extractive ones. This week, I spoke with Rodrigo Cámara-Leret of the Department of Evolutionary Biology and Environmental Studies at the University of Zurich to understand just how biologically diverse the island is and the challenges it faces. I also spoke with Danny Heatubun, head of the Research and Development Agency of the provincial government of West Papua, about the recent Manowari Declaration initiated by his province to commit to protecting 70% of its forest cover. And finally, in Papua New Guinea, abbreviated as PNG, the independent nation that comprises the eastern half of the island, I spoke with Miriam Supuma of Synchronicity Earth about what sets PNG apart from the Indonesian provinces of New Guinea, what customary land rights mean to the nation, and NGO efforts to give indigenous inhabitants resources they need to protect their land. New Guinea has a complex history, and news about the island changes by the day, and for experts working in the field there is hope, but much work to be done. The island is shared by two nations, Indonesia on the western side, which is made of two provinces, West Papua and Papua, the latter of those two provinces which shares a border with the independent nation of Papua New Guinea, which makes up the eastern half of the island. While it retains 80% of its forest cover, nearly 1.15 million hectares of forest have been lost since 2002. I turned to Rodrigo Cámara-Leret to get his perspective on the island's flora, fauna, as well as its culture.
My name is Rodrigo Cámara-Leret. I am a senior researcher at the University of Zurich. To me, New Guinea is unique in having the most diversity of organisms in the world, and at the same time being the most linguistically diverse region in the world. So not only one of the fascinating aspects are found in New Guinea, it has both. It has this astonishing biocultural diversity, which in my eyes makes it a unique place.
It's difficult to accurately depict just how unique the island is, as the number of the endemic plant and animal species alone are almost hard to wrap your mind around. The island holds an estimated 13,634 plant species and 3,962 tree species.
So yeah, that's the number of species that taxonomists have recognized so far. But we estimate that in the next 50 years, the list will grow by at least 4,000 to 5,000 species. This is because many parts of New Guinea remain undercollected, so we do not know new species that might be growing there. But also, many of the collections that have been accumulating in scientific institutions have yet to be formally studied. So, list is surely to grow.
There are many reasons why New Guinea is so diverse, from its tectonic history to its location on the globe to its extreme topography, and is the only place in the world that has lowlands and beaches and alpine glaciers on the same tropical island.
The factors that explain why New Guinea is so diverse have to do, first, with its area. It is the world's largest tropical island. Second, its location. It's not only in the tropics, but it's also like in the junction between Malaysia, Australia, and the Pacific. So it contains plants from all these areas, plus 68% of its flora is endemic. This endemism has partly to do with its very high habitat diversity and extreme topographic gradients. So from mangrove to peat swamp forest to montane forest up to alpine grasslands. It has actually the most extensive alpine grasslands in Southeast Asia, and it has the highest habitat diversity of any island in Southeast Asia. And on top of that, it's its highly complex tectonic history, which has resulted in a great diversity of soils and led to different floristic compositions across the region.
If you're familiar at all with our previous podcast series on Sumatra, you may remember some of the deforestation drivers impacting that island, and it's not a surprise that many of those same drivers are present here. However, New Guinea is not nearly as developed, but experts worry that is swiftly changing.
From about 2001 to 2019, 2% of old-growth forests have been cleared. These are partly associated to mining and road building. Others are due to selective timber extraction, fires, shifting agriculture, and landslides. It's not such a high figure because more than half of it may recover if it's not further impacted. But what is more worrying is the current road building scenario that is planned in New Guinea, where about 4,000 kilometers of a Trans-Papua highway are being built. This project started back in the 1970s, but it really accelerated after the year 2000. And New Guinea at the moment is quite intact. Over 80% of its original forest cover remains intact. But we worry that over the coming decades, this situation might change.
New Guinea, and particularly Papua, has long been a land of conflict. Since the annexation of Dutch colonial rule around 1963, many movements for Papua to become its own country have grown from this, which are largely, sometimes violently, resisted by the central Indonesian government. Suffice it to say that amidst this political strife, conservation here has been difficult to implement. The result currently is that Papuans, those living in the Indonesian half of the island, do not have customary land rights. That is, their land can be sold to developers of palm oil, pulp and paper, and other extractives. They do not own the land on which they live. Yet, studies have shown that indigenous peoples are the most effective of any group of people on Earth at preventing deforestation and conserving ecosystems. And the central government has yet to grant land rights to any indigenous group in Papua. In 2018, the Manowari Declaration was signed by the governors of the 2 provinces of Papua, which commits to protecting 70% of its forest cover. It's a 14-point declaration that includes as the second top priority, protect the rights and strengthen the role of indigenous peoples. The purpose of the declaration is not just conservation, but sustainable economic development, which Rodrigo describes as to become Southeast Asia's Costa Rica.
In the year 2018, the governors of Indonesia's 2 New Guinea provinces signed the Manowari Declaration. Manowari comes from the city of Manowari in the province of West Papua. And in that declaration, they committed to the conservation of 70% of the forest cover of the western half of the island. Before that, There had been the 2011 declaration of Tambrau as a conservation district. And then in 2015, the declaration of Papua Barat or West Papua province as a conservation province. But in 2018, the two local governors of both provinces got together and signed this commitment, which aims to make Western New Guinea Southeast Asia's Costa Rica in terms of conservation. The governors see great potential in conserving biodiversity and at the same time developing through a green economy model in which they promote ecotourism, and they also seek for ways to develop through local biodiversity agriculture. So the Manowari Declaration has 14 key points. Among them, it includes the need to protect the rights and strengthen the role of indigenous groups. Others have to do with strengthening capacity building efforts related to protected areas, which are currently understaffed. And others have to do with reviewing the current status of plantations. And there have been some promising advances since 2018 in that regard.
Some of those advances include revoking palm oil permits totaling more than twice the size of Los Angeles. A recent Greenpeace report shows that 1/5 of all palm oil plantations in Indonesia are illegal. However, the central government has revoked comparably few of these permits since the moratorium on new ones was issued by the Jokowi administration. However, the government of West Papua has revoked quite a lot by comparison, making good on their commitment to review and revoke permits in violation, 14 of which were revoked since the moratorium. In the case of the Sorong district, the local government revoked several palm oil permits, citing multiple violations.
Recently, the West Papua local government, working together with the National Anti-Corruption Agency, like KPK, revoked permits for 12 oil palm concessions that were being harvested or exploited illegally. This is a significant advance. In the area that these oil palm concessions cover is about twice the size of the city of Los Angeles. So they are doing what they said they would do in the West Papua province. Things in the eastern part are moving a bit slowly. The efforts to do this have not yet crystallized. And then there are also concerns that roads are advancing quite fast, even into protected areas such as the Lawrence UNESCO World Heritage Site. This is important because the Lawrence UNESCO World Heritage Site is the only protected area in the world which has an intact transect from snow-capped mountain glaciers to lowland wetlands. And it is actually Southeast Asia's largest protected area.
In addition to road concerns, there are also larger projects which consistently draw criticism for their environmental impact. The Tanah project, which is the largest palm oil plantation project in the world, is fraught with allegations of forgery on its permits, which initially appears to be sold as a food security project, but it ended up displacing locals as well as failing to yield much food at all.
I know I'm not an expert in that project, but I think it's an example of or how a project should not be done. As far as I know, the central government of Indonesia proposed to develop food security in Papua province through promoting the development of agriculture in Tanah Merah, which is located in the eastern part of Papua province, almost in the border with Papua New Guinea. And one of the concerns was that a lot of the food that Papuans were now consuming was imported. So the project was sold as an initiative to develop local food security. However, that aim has not happened. In fact, the Tanah Merah project has been severely criticized because of concerns about the translocation of local communities, forced displacement, also the failure of developing these crops. They planted rice, but the harvest of rice was really meager. And even the migrants that came from Java and other islands were promised a future that did not happen. So they were left with nothing in another land. So from their perspective, it was also a really severe situation for them and their families. And so we have to take these initiatives with a lot of criticism. I think they have also a significant impact on biodiversity. And as you know, the current situation in Indonesia is that land is already being used up in the West, in Sumatra and Borneo. And so Papua is seen as the promising region where to develop the future of oil palm. However, this is not really how the local governments are seeing the situation. And so they are aiming to reverse this trend of an exploitative economy in which their biodiversity is completely eroded for oil palm. And instead, they're trying to promote a more green economy, sustainable economy, and also one that is aligned with the needs of local communities.
The commitments made in the Manowari Declaration ring positive for Papua. However, many Papuans are not happy with the process that has led up to this point, particularly the central government's role in denying indigenous land rights, and for many Papuans, their independence. After the Dutch left Papua in the 1960s, a vote, which Rodrigo describes as forced, was taken in 1969 to decide whether Papua would be independent or remain as a part of Indonesia. The Indonesian military selected 1,000 individuals from a population of around 800,000. All of them unanimously voted to remain with Indonesia. Even though this vote was called the Act of Free Choice, many criticize its undemocratic process, and there is wide sentiment to redo it even to this day. In effect, Papuans are sometimes forced by the Indonesian military to give up their land for plantations. PNG, on the other hand, retains customary land rights for all its original inhabitants. However, as we'll note later, this doesn't necessarily always prevent exploitation.
One main difference that sets apart Papua New Guinea from Indonesian New Guinea is that in Papua New Guinea, local communities have complete governance of the land they occupy. This is not the situation, as far as I know, in the Indonesian side, since its administration by the Indonesian government, possibly even before that by the Dutch, who colonized the island. So the PNG is distinct in that regard. And so local communities have complete liberty to decide what they want to do. And so if they want to put an oil palm plantation, then they will do that. And if they prefer to go for conservation, then they will do that. And this is not the case in the West, as far as I know. And there are many stories about communities being displaced or forced by the Indonesian army to lease their lands or make them available for these large agricultural projects such as oil palm or even mining. I think especially agricultural developments and logging are also tightly associated because it's often the companies that are involved in logging, they are the first to enter a piece of land, and then that land is then turned into an oil palm plantation, and the companies that do that are associated with both logging and agriculture. So there are great benefits in terms of economy, but huge human rights issues. And the situation is difficult. There are also calls for more transparency and freedom of press in the Indonesian side. And well, as you surely know, there's also a semi-guerrilla movement, the West Papua Liberation Army, that seeks to change the current political situation of being part of Indonesia. So, as you know, the island of New Guinea initially was not at all under the influence of any European power, but in the 1500s, the first sailors started to reach the island. And well, it was hundreds of sailors that would visit through the navigations. In fact, the island of New Guinea receives its name from a Spanish sailor who he coined the term. So Nueva Guinea is the name. That was in 1545, Íñigo Ortiz de Retez. And subsequently, the Dutch were the first to occupy the western part of the island as part of their efforts to dominate the trade of spices. Later on, the eastern part of New Guinea became occupied by different European powers, the German and the British. And there was pressure for the Dutch to leave, and that crystallized in a vote a forced vote, let's put it that way, from the central government of Indonesia to the locals of New Guinea, Western New Guinea, which was called at the time Irian Jaya by the Dutch, to decide whether they wanted to be part of Indonesia or not. But there were lots of critics of how the process developed. That many critics said that it was done almost under force, and since it was not conducted democratically across the region, but on forced, then they feel that they should be given that opportunity to do that again. That was called the Act of Free Choice, and there was a lot of pressure at the time by the United States for the Dutch to leave, and as a result of that, there was this movement called the Organisasi, I think, Papua Merdeka, or like Free Papua movement, to liberate, or like it's an independence movement for West Papua. West Papua being Indonesia and New Guinea nowadays. And they are in the news often. You'll hear 12 soldiers shot in the Grasberg mine by the Free Papua movement.
The Grasberg mine is the largest reserve of gold in the world and the second largest of copper. It is often hotly criticized for its environmental impact, and despite the fact that over $3.8 billion of revenue was generated for its parent company, Freeport-McMoRan, in 2016, Papua remains the poorest province of Indonesia, where 28% of the population lives below the poverty line. Over the past few months, several attacks resulting in a number of deaths of security guards or miners have occurred at the site, and local police have blamed these on members of the Free Papua movement.
But if you don't know, Grasberg is the world's largest gold mine, which is found in near Timika in Papua province. And it's actually under the governance of Freeport-McMoRan, which is a company based in, I believe, in New Orleans in the United States. But it's also Indonesia's largest taxpayer. And it's also a huge contaminator in the region, disposing lots of minerals into the sea. You can see it from space. This mine is the largest open pit gold mine, and I think the second largest copper mine in the world. So this movement has been focused in that region, has developed in that region, and sometimes it's not so clear whether it's actually the people of that movement killing or shooting soldiers. I've also heard that it's actually people or kind of setting up those situations so that the soldiers are constantly hired. You know what I mean?
I turned to Danny Heatubun of the provincial government of West Papua's Sustainable Development Agency to hear his account of the Manowari Declaration, the progress made so far, and the challenges to implementing its commitments.
My name is Danny Heatubun. So I'm actually still hold my position as a forest botany professor in Faculty of Forestry, University of Papua, local university in Manokwari. But at the moment, I've been appointed by Governor of West Papua. I'm in charge now to establish and develop research and development agency in West Papua province. So my agency is a provincial government institution with responsibility to carry out research and also related with all innovation. So we want to speeding up sustainable development in West Papua province. So if you heard about international conference on biodiversity, ecotourism, and also creative economy in 2018, we come up with Manowari Declaration. So that's actually the big momentum carry out by I myself and also my agency. So that's it is like a big achievement in West Papua, and now we shift the goals of development now become as sustainable development province, the first sustainable province in Indonesia, or also in the world, because long before in 2015 we declare ourselves being the first conservation province in Indonesia.
You'll hear Charlie mention two different legislative actions here. The first is a very recent revision of the original 2001 Special Autonomy Law. This was something revised not by Papua, but by the Indonesian parliament that says that its aim is to fast-track development in Papua. However, it's being met with criticism by Papuans. The second piece of legislation was created by Papua, called Perdasus No. 9, which seeks to give customary land rights back to indigenous people. However, some Papuans argue that the Special Autonomy Law, which strips local governments in Papua of its ability to declare customary land, should simply include in it the ability for Papuans to self-determine, rather than having to go through approval of the central government, which hasn't recognized indigenous land rights in Papua or West Papua, as of this recording.
Yeah, we have a big momentum in 2008 when we come up with Manowari Declaration. That's the really a big achievement. So we now shift our orientation about how to develop economy, how to speeding up or acceleration regional development in Papua and West Papua province. Based on Manowari Declaration, which is we put how to protect and honoring the local community, local people with their customary right. We put in the really high position. So from this Manowari Declaration, now we also in the national level we already revised the law of special autonomy for Papua and West Papua. But at the same time, we also have a special regulation in a provincial level. So in 2018, we passed the bill we call Perdasus. In Indonesia, Peraturan Daerah Khusus number 9 in the year 2019. So this is a special regulation to honoring local communities and also their territory, their customary rights, and also their land. So this is really a big achievement. And then if we work from that regulation, now we in the state in the process of implementation. So when we mention about reviewing license of oil palms, so we come up with really good policy. So in West Papua province, we are the first province in Indonesia that carry out reviewing oil palm concession. So we work together with Indonesian Commission for Corruption Eradication, or KPK, and also with the development partners. So we being the first province and become the really good samples, and then revoke for the license. It also means that we really follow the regulation. We now put honoring the customary right in the high position, and then now we will in the discussion. Yeah, we have a long discussion, which is the best strategy to give him back the land.
This is where things can become complicated, because in order to grant customary land rights to indigenous people, their lands must be mapped, put together in a proposal, and sent off to the central government in Jakarta, which must then review the proposal and either accept it or reject it. This is why some locals and district heads are not happy with the Special Autonomy Law revision, among a few other reasons.
We want to mapping the local customary land, and then we will put together, we will synchronize with our spatial planning, because we now in the process of revise our spatial planning for the province or the regional province. Yeah.
Indeed, this is a complex process, as staff reporter Hans Nicholas Young notes in a piece published on October 27, 2021. Every step of this process is long, arduous, and expensive. Nationwide, the ministry has granted titles to just 80 communities for a total of 59,442 hectares of land under the Customary scheme as of July this year, far short of the 10.56 million hectares of customary forests that have been independently mapped by 833 indigenous communities across Indonesia. Those maps were submitted to the ministry in 2019. Local officials, including Danny on this podcast, have cited disagreements between indigenous groups as to the boundaries of their lands as being a reason this process has been slow. But some Papuans say that the central government is the primary hurdle in the process.
We have really big ethnicity in this province. So it's about 65 different ethnic groups or tribes. So ethnic group or tribes, they have different customary land, and then they should recognize as a legal asset. For their legal asset, they need to mapping process. So it means we need a lot of energy. We need a lot of money because we have to send people with the instrumentation like global position unit, GPS. They need to using drones, and then they need to put coordinate the border between one clan and different clan, and then before put border, they need to sit down and discuss long discussion about they belongs, they right, because sometimes they don't agree between one another.
What Danny says they need from the central government is a decree called a Hutan Adat. It's a letter that establishes customary land status for Papuans. He calls this the dream of Papua and West Papua.
We're not in fully have the authorization to decide it. Also, still need the central government to issue. It is like a special letter or decree about the indigenous forest management. So it's a special status that in Indonesia we call Hutan Adat. So Hutan Adat is actually what we really want to give to our local community or our indigenous people to manage their forest and also their land. So this is we're still struggling to try to get the status from the central government, because when we try to empower local people, local communities, and then they also have their organization in customary rights, and then they could propose special status to central government. So like my government, like provincial government and also district government, they will provide a recommendation letter, and then the proposal which goes through the central government, and then central government will issue the letter or the special status of the forest. So this is our dream. It's actually our dream in Papua and also West Papua province, that in other part of Indonesia, other local peoples or local communities or other communities in other area, they already granted, they already get the status. But in Papua and also in West Papua, until now we still want to, the process is still, we're waiting from the central government.
For all this, Danny says progress has been made on the spatial planning of the actual protected area. Before the revision process was completed, only 36.4% was protected. However, after the latest revision, an area of 67.8% of forest cover is being given protected or conservation status, which Danny says is also in the process of being submitted in a proposal to the central government for approval. This nearly reaches their commitment goal. True to the moratorium on palm oil permits, no new ones are to be granted, and of the existing ones in compliance, ways to make this sector more sustainable are said to be prioritized in the declaration.
Yeah, when we talk about spatial plan, so in the map, we now in the process of revising, and then we still waiting for the final decision from a central government. But before we revising the protected and conservation area, we have 36.4% our forest is under protected. It means that in the status of protected forest and also within the conservation status. Because in our system, Indonesian government, we have different, nomenclature, different terminology. So hutan lindung is protected forest. We have also a conservation area, means kawasan konservasi in Indonesia, and then we have different state, different level of conservation terminology and also status. So yeah, but now I got information from my colleague, which they now in the process of revising. So now the protected and conservation status is 67.8%. So it's almost 70%.
Given the complexities mentioned so far to this point, in not just conserving and protecting forest cover in Papua, but giving customary land rights to indigenous peoples, Charlie says the biggest challenge to implement the Manowari Declaration is getting all parties involved on the same page, which Charlie says is particularly important in the case of the provincial government of West Papua and the central government of Indonesia. He says that if he could wave a magic wand, it would be to get the decrees necessary and the money and the resources for indigenous communities to develop their own land, since they already have the inherent knowledge on how to best take care of and utilize it.
Big challenge actually put all people together in the same perspective. Yeah, we have many people with their own perspective, their own agenda, their own interests. That's actually really big challenge to us. So now is how to get all together, and then they have to agree, and then they also involved with the process of implementation of Manowari Declaration. And even we have a different perspective between us in local government with the central government about the Manowari Declaration. So now we need to, people have the same thing, people have the same perspective. Based on that, all resource, all energy will be putting together, and then we will get what actually we want to achieve together. The regulation from central government is also one of the issue. One, if we want to, if I have magic wands, and then yeah, I just want to make that we got regulation from central government that they also support Manowari Declaration. They will be allocate, money to support the implementation in the field, in the ground. And then yeah, we also want to see local people, local communities, or indigenous people, they have a capacity to develop their, not only their self, but also about the organization of other, of local organization. So when they really good in the organization, they have a capacity. It means that we don't have to worry about the future, because they know what they have to do, because they already have their local wisdom. They live very close with the nature. They have really close relation with the forest, they land. So that's, yeah, I just want to see that local people, local communities, indigenous people, they have capacity to make their living. They have capacity to growing their local economy, and also at the same time they also have a capacity to develop their industry.
Charlie says he wants to see indigenous people prosper, and he closed by citing a quote from his governor, which states, Our main duty is to inherit springs for our children and grandchildren, not the other way around. This is in reference to the Indonesian word for springs, which, when spoken backward, says tears.
I would see indigenous people and local Papuan communities, they are prosper and the forests remain sustainable. And also my governor, the governor of West Papua, always says in his speech, our main task or duty is to inherit springs for our children and grandchildren, not to the other way around, inherit tears for them. Because if we say this in Indonesia, springs and tears, they have same words, but we put different around. So when we say springs, it's mata air. So when we say tears, is air mata. Yeah, so its main task or duty is to inherit springs for our children and grandchildren or future generation, not to the other way around to inherit tears for them.
Rodrigo agrees that sustainable commodities should be developed, but as long as they are in line with the interests of local communities, which are increasingly interested in things like ecotourism. However, if extracted commodities have stripped the resources of the land on which locals reside, then they will become dependent on them since there will be no land resources left for them to use, exacerbating poverty. Further complicating this is the fact that many businesses in the more populated areas are already dominated by non-Papuans, leaving local and indigenous Papuans with limited options for revenue.
I think, first of all, we have to consider the interests of local communities to develop their future as they wish. So if these extractive projects are in their interests, then, this should be something open to them to decide if they have, as we discussed, the tenure to their lands. Now, it's another situation if these extractive projects are forced upon them. My experience so far there has been that local people are really interested in promoting ecotourism. New Guinea has at least 39 species of birds of paradise, has amazing coral reefs, and it also has unique habitats such as alpine grasslands or really wonderful tropical forests where you can just explore so many different plant species and birds. In terms of the potential to compete with things like oil palm, it depends how you define compete. If compete is that most of the revenues of the oil palm are going away to companies and local communities are not seeing anything, then I think that's one thing. On the other hand, if these extractive projects affect the future of these communities so that they are no longer living in an area that delivers them with the ability to fish because their waters are full of contaminants, or the ability to harvest wild nuts or starch from the sago palm, things like this, If these needs are not anymore met because extractive projects have been set up in their lands, then there's a big problem, because it means that these communities become through time completely dependent on the mainstream economy. And New Guinea's inhabitants currently subsist very tightly in dependence with local resources. So if you do away with this and there's no other substitute, what we find is that there's increased poverty. And already the Indonesian Papua and West Papua are Indonesia's poorest provinces with the lowest rates of literacy. It also means that there will be more migration to cities. And in these cities, what we are finding is that the composition is no longer dominantly Papuan, but it is actually becoming more non-Papuan. And it's estimated that most of the main businesses are currently led by non-Papuans. You see this in the supermarkets and other businesses, that it's usually people from other islands, right? And Papuans are often found in the streets selling minor products, which have give them very little revenue. So, we have to, I think, frame this more holistically than just how much money you can get now, but see this as a long-term situation. And Papuans are really proud of their ancestry, of their land, and of their relationships with nature. And in many cases, they are not happy at all to see that these companies are invading their lands and leaving them with no future, as I explained before. So if there's a prospect of developing through the bioeconomy in a way that is aligned with their needs, then I think this is a good way, and the government sees it as in this regard. I mean, Papuans, it's their members coming from different parts of the region with different cultures, so they know quite well the situation rather than this being forced upon them from other islands.
Protection of New Guinea's forests is a high-stakes situation for both indigenous people and also for anyone relying on the knowledge of the usefulness of the plants in these forests. There were at least 3,400 useful plants identified by New Guineans, but only 19% of New Guinea's 1,100 indigenous groups have ever been consulted. So the loss of indigenous culture and indigenous language also means the loss of the knowledge of many potentially useful plants, including medicinal ones. In fact, a recent study conducted by the University of Zurich found that much of existing medicinal plant knowledge is tied to indigenous languages. This study included the Amazon, New Guinea, and North America, and they found that 75% of medicinal plant uses are known in only one language. This was published in a story on Mongabay on the 20th of September, 2021.
So, well, New Guinea, as you mentioned, has over 13,000 plant species, and 68% of them are endemic. Some of these extremely unique plants include the world's largest banana, which can grow to more than 20 meters tall, with massive fruits and leaves like over 5 meters long. And this is really a spectacular tree. It's actually a herb, but it looks like a tree. Also, orchids are extremely diverse, with over 86% of them endemic to New Guinea. And these include some really bizarre species, such as a species that flowers, well, it opens its flowers after dark and it closes them in the morning, and it's called Bulbophyllum nocturnum. Or there are other orchids, for example, that have appendages that mimic spiders, in this case, Bulbophyllum tarantula. There are also very extremely interesting plants that are tightly coupled with people's subsistence, such as Mectroxylon sago, which is the sago palm. And, New Guinea has, in most textbooks of hunter-gatherer societies, been basically omitted, saying that there were no hunter-gatherer societies there, that most of them are horticulturalists. But recent studies have shown that, in fact, if we consider sago as a way of foraging, there could be up to 100 different societies in New Guinea that fit this broader classification of hunter-gatherers. So sago is also an iconic plant that is crucial for Papuans' livelihoods. And what is also interesting is the cultural complexity in New Guinea is also tightly coupled to having not only access to sago, but also to a constant source of protein. So we see some of the most elaborate crafts in New Guinea by the Asmat who both forage on sago and also fish year round. So I think this comes to show that this tight coupling between plant and human societies and between biological and cultural diversity. In a review we did a few years ago of about 500 references published since the 1800s about the useful plants of New Guinea, we found that there are at least 3,400 plants that are known to New Guineans to be useful. This might seem a lot, but actually in the literature, only 217 or 19% of New Guinea's 1,100 indigenous groups have been studied. So there's surely much more we can learn from human-plant interactions in New Guinea with more research.
And finally, I turned to Miriam Supuma, a program manager at Synchronicity Earth, who has an extensive breadth of knowledge and experience working in conservation in Papua New Guinea, to explain to me what about Papua New Guinea is unique, what the challenges are to conservation, and what she sees as the way forward. As is the case with Papua, PNG is incredibly topographically diverse, making it hard to study. Miriam mentions that this is partly due to the lack of field biologists. And additionally, over 800 different languages exist in the country. making it the most linguistically diverse country in the world.
Good day, Mike. My name is Miriam Supuma, and I work with the Synchronicity. I started working in the field of conservation about 20 years ago with the Wildlife Conservation Society, a Papua New Guinea program. Later on, about 8 years down the line, I and a few of my colleagues, we set up a small national NGO called the Institute of Biological Research. And I've been working with that NGO to help raise capacity of national biologists, conservationists. I worked with the Institute of Biological Research for over 6 years. It was one of the most rewarding career opportunities that I've had. Papua New Guinea is, I think, one of the last remaining tropical island biodiversities in the world. And this is apart from the Congo Basin and the Amazon. New Guinea has 7% of at least around 7% of the Earth's biodiversity. It is least studied, and part of it is because of the limited number of national biologists or capacity within the country. The country is quite unique in that we have over 800 languages representing distinct cultures. In addition to that, we have different biomes. We have from lowland, sea level, corals to montane, alpine habitats. And within that, we've got diverse people with different cultures who relate to the environment in various ways. So it is one of the unique countries in the world.
Indonesia is actually the next most linguistically diverse nation on the planet, second only to PNG, having around 600 to 700 distinct spoken languages. And while it may seem apparent being on the same island, both Papua and PNG share many of the same flora and fauna, as well as deforestation drivers. In addition, many cultures are shared between the two countries.
I can say that there's a big distinction between Papua New Guinea and Papua. But I know for sure that in terms of linguistic diversity, Indonesia has the second largest diversity in languages after Papua New Guinea. I think around 700 or 600. So in terms of cultural diversity, it does have that as well. New Guinea, the island of New Guinea, we share, Papua New Guinea and Papua, we share a lot of species, biodiversity. In terms of, as an example, I'll give you the birds of paradise. These are shared between the different parts of the island. We have similar mammal species. There are a few that are distinct to Papua. In terms of environmental threats, there are some similarities that we share. In terms of the local people or the customs or the culture, before the borders were even drawn up, the people were moving back and forth, and there's cultural connections between people of Papua New Guinea and Papua. So the border in itself is very porous. So people travel back and forth because of the deep cultural ties that they have.
Oil palm is the key deforestation driver in PNG, and as has been explained in previous episodes in our series, including this one, it severely impacts a community's ability to take care of or use their land.
In Papua New Guinea, we're experiencing deforestation, particularly with respect to plantations, oil palm plantations. And this has been quite common along the coastal areas where it's accessible. For example, in one of the islands, the West New Britain Island, there's a lot of areas, I can't give you the figures for sure, but a lot of areas that have been cleared for oil palm agriculture, and that is monocropping. That in itself is one of the factors in which we're seeing rapid loss in connection of communities to access their traditional land, and also with respect to benefits to the communities. So there's a lot of controversy or disharmony in some of the communities where oil palm has been happening.
As we've mentioned on this episode, unlike Papua and West Papua, all of the land in PNG is owned by locals, and on a policy level, it cannot be sold without consultation with local groups or indigenous groups who must then agree to any development on their land.
Customary land rights is one of the fundamental piece or part of Papua New Guineans. It is something that connects us to land, and it is something that was there for a very long time, in which there are no historical records of. So here in Papua New Guinea, land is owned by kinship groups or clans, and it cannot be sold, it cannot be divided, or it cannot be open for projects or what, unless there is communal discussion amongst the community members or the clan members. So every decision based on land is done by the kinship group. In that regard, for any activities, any projects that is on a customary land has to be given consent by the people who have traditional ties to the land.
However, it happens anyway due to a number of factors, such as isolation in rural areas and the inherent language barriers presented by outside developers encroaching on land that isn't theirs. On top of that, developers may also outright lie to communities about having permission to develop on their land. Given this, it can be difficult for communities to make a legal case against developers when there is little access to outside help or consultation resources to aid in the litigation process. This type of conflict isn't unique to PNG, but it does mean that customary land rights still go unrecognized for many communities.
Our country recognizes traditional rights, customary rights, the rights of its traditional custodians. And it is only in the practice of it that sometimes this is not taken account of. And this is in the case of where indigenous traditional people are further away from areas where there is no greater telecommunication access, no roads, or where it's low literacy rates in the community. So when we have a development company or a logging company turning up in the rural area, it is often difficult for local people to have their voices heard because they don't have access to inform outside or get help. And this is not only happening within PNG, this is happening outside as well. So in terms of rights to land and access to land, communities know of the ancestral rights, but in terms of making a legal case or knowing that the country's law recognizes their rights, oftentimes those people who have interest for development sometimes tell them other information which may not be quite true, in that they may say the government has given permission and you have no right to stop us from doing what we want to do. So this is becoming a problem in some of the areas where there are isolated communities.
However, some NGOs are providing information to communities so that they know their rights and resources to protect those rights, namely the Bismarck Ramu Group, which is a partner of Synchronicity Earth, and the Center for Environmental Law and Community Rights.
What is happening is that some of the efforts, NGO efforts, are trying to ensure that these communities have access to information that is not usually available to these isolated communities, that these communities know their rights, their traditional rights, their customary rights, as well as their overall rights to seek redress if they want to make their case known. So there are few NGOs that are doing such work like that. That is I can give you an example, is the Bismarck Ramu Group. And then there's Center for Environmental Law and Community Rights. Synchronicity Earth is supporting groups such as Bismarck Ramu Group. In fact, Bismarck Ramu Group is one of the partners of Synchronicity Earth. We understand the importance of raising awareness and providing right information to communities. By supporting such group as Bismarck Ramu Group, we are helping communities to be able to make decision on ways in which they see is best for them in self-determined way, to safeguard the environment, to determine how they want to progress with economic activities. So in doing so, the communities have a say and have a right, they're exercising their right to be able to self-govern their environment and their resources, basically.
One example of NGO efforts paying off came when a deep-sea mining venture in the Bismarck Sea faced immense community pushback and legal roadblocks over concerns of the unknown impacts of deep-sea mining. This resulted in a 10-year moratorium on any kind of deep-sea mining in Papua New Guinea. However, the license for exploration wasn't revoked and can be sold to another investor. Mining potentially could resume again in 10 years. And some Pacific islands are already planning on it, specifically Nauru, which informed the International Seabed Authority of its plans to use the Metals Company for a deep-sea mining operation 2 years from now, which gives the ISA that amount of time to develop governing rules around the industry.
In Papua New Guinea and in the Pacific, there is a growing network of advocates, and one of them in 2020, we got to see a lot of Pacific Islanders come together to raise their voice with regards to deep sea mining. One of our local groups here, the Alliance of Solwara Warriors, in which it also partners with other Pacific Island NGOs and groups throughout the Pacific. They unified to express their concern over the potential for deep sea mining in the Pacific. And I believe it was in 2020 in Fiji during one of the international Pacific meetings, they announced a 10-year moratorium to halt deep sea mining until such time when there was sufficient information, better understanding of the impacts, the potential impacts of deep sea mining. This is one of the positive things that have come out, is the power of mobilizing communities to have a unified voice to raise concerns about the issues that are affecting not only one country, but also the wider Pacific. So with this 10-year moratorium, at the time, the Papua New Guinea Prime Minister mentioned that it supports the moratorium, but we have yet to see how far this can go here in Papua New Guinea, whether the exploration licenses will be cancelled. To my understanding, these licenses have not been cancelled yet. So there's potential for the company that's holding on to the license to sell it to another potential investor. So the threat is still there.
This is the case for a lot of Pacific islands that are searching for ways to bring in revenue. Many are turning to this industry, even considering the unknown environmental costs. Miriam wants to see more countries follow PNG's example, and for PNG to cancel the licenses that currently exist.
Recent news, it was maybe 2 months ago, another Pacific island, I think it was Nauru, they were thinking of going ahead with deep sea mining in, say, 2 years' time. So I think there's a potential that could happen again. But this is the situation for most Pacific islands. Some are small nations with their, in terms of economic activities happening. You can either depend on fisheries or tourism, and they are looking for ways to try bring in revenues to their country. So while the moratorium is there, it doesn't mean that other countries will try to seek ways outside to pursue this. So yeah, it is a tricky situation. But we want to see, for those countries that support the moratorium, like Papua New Guinea, while the government said it supports it, we want to see it put into action by cancelling the licenses that currently exist.
While PNG has other economic incentives currently, many of them, such as the oil and gas sector, still occur on land that hasn't received consultation from locals, violating their customary land rights. Miriam says this is why supporting community-based NGOs is crucial.
Papua New Guinea has a different number of ways to raise revenues. For some small Pacific Island countries like Tuvalu, Kiribati, mostly depending on fisheries and tourism. With COVID, now that is a pandemic around the world, we see less travel, so it's affecting the economy as well. For Papua New Guinea, we have diverse ways of income. We've got our fisheries, we've got agriculture. We also have oil and gas sector. Again, this extractive industry, which also is done on customary land. So there's going to be always concerns there, especially if community rights consent is not given to the community members there. This is why supporting groups such as Bismarck Ramo Group or CELCO is important, because their work reaches down to the community level, where they inform communities of their rights, of how they want to see development or sustainable development taking place on their land.
I asked Miriam for her perspective on the way forward for conservation in Papua New Guinea, and her answer may not come as a surprise, but it bears repeating. Like many nations across the planet, PNG is focusing on non-renewable industries, and this, Miriam says, is not the way forward, and that there is more potential in renewable sectors, and even in conservation management as a revenue generator across multiple sectors, ensuring that local communities retain access to the land while benefiting from the resources these sectors create.
I think that the government of the day is putting too much focus on non-renewable industries, such as the oil and gas sector. There is a lot of potential in the renewable resource sector or natural resource sector. For instance, if we look at conservation as a management way for ensuring that the resources is harvested sustainably into the future, we can still be able to generate income to the country, but also ensure that the communities, the rural communities, still have access to this resource and are able to sustain themselves. And this can be in the fisheries sector, this could be in forestry, this could be in cash crops, coconut, which is something that's, of course, an abundance here in the Pacific.
Miriam also said there's potential for ecotourism as well. She further elucidated on the misconception that conservation is often seen as preservation only, disregarding the need to bring in economic incentives, and this has undermined conservation and all the ensuing potential economic benefits and quality of life factors that many locals want, such as education.
And then this could also be in relation to bringing in ecotourism. We've got beautiful seas here in the Pacific, and when we cultivate this, make it accessible to outside, not only that people come to appreciate what we have, the diversity, but also bring in income to the local people that depend on these natural resources. So I think conservation has been undermined for a long time. And people think that we are strictly wanting to preserve, but the way in which the world is, everyone, especially even in rural areas, also need a form of income. They're realizing the potential for education and what that could mean to their livelihood. So it means education. In order to get education, they have to send kids to school. And to do that, you need to have income. So when we invest in generating sustainable income using and investing in natural resource management, that in itself involves conservation, which is an overlooked area in the country.
Miriam pointed out that some of the challenges that the entire island has historically faced are part of the reason why so much of the forest remains intact, and that while improving access to resources for locals is needed, it must be done carefully.
I think the island of New Guinea is incredibly diverse. It also is one of the places where it has many challenges. It's in terms of accessibility to reach some of the interior places. It's quite challenging in that there's no good road network. And while it might be challenging in that regard, it is perhaps one of the reasons why we still have some of the forest remaining in the interior, probably less access for development to happen. But again, there are people in those isolated places who still want to be able to have access to services that are seen in some of the urban areas. So it is quite challenging. It is Papua New Guinea and Papua, the beautiful parts of the world. I think there's so much to learn from it. There's still so much to do in these places. And in terms of conservation, right now we have competing interests, extractive industry, as well as I see, conservation as well. They can go hand in hand, but they also need to inform and bring in the local people who are very much the custodians, where much of the forest or the land in which there's current interest in. And it is very much unexplored. And if we are not very careful, we could lose a lot of it in a lifetime. And this would not only mean in terms of the physical environment gone, but the knowledge and the deep connection to the environment itself, to the forest, to the sea as well. When we talk about tenure or land, we often don't include seascape. So many rural people, especially coastal, depend on the sea just as much as the forest for livelihood.
Miriam finished by saying that educated New Guineans are essential to the future of conservation. It's no secret that raising money for conservation efforts on a public or private scale is challenging, but she says the mindset needs to go towards the long term, as many conservation efforts take years or decades to come to fruition. But this kind of capacity building takes resources and consistently well-supported nationals. Ultimately, Miriam believes this isn't just important for conservation, but managing all natural resources.
One of the way forward is ensuring that we have enough educated Papua New Guineans in conservation, biodiversity, natural resource management, but also a challenge for not only the government, but NGOs and even donors to support people in these professions to be able to do their work. Oftentimes we, especially in the NGO sector, we're finding it challenges. I'm speaking from my experience that many of the NGOs have a challenge trying to fundraise for project activities in the communities, but at the same time trying to ensure that they're able to have the most qualified person do those activities and to be able to see noticeable change. It is good to see projects that are supported on a multi-year scale than on a short-term basis. So changing mindset, informing communities, even for community groups that are trying to seek redress and going through the legal pathways. It does not happen within a year. It sometimes takes years. And for conservationists trying to understand, home range of animals in the natural habitat or fisheries migration or collecting long-term data for fisheries migration or data. It takes multiple years to be able to see, collect those data to understand patterns before you can make decisions that could safeguard the species management as well. So capacity building or training nationals is in itself is helping to secure the future of conservation, but also helping to secure management of natural resources in the country.
I want to thank Miriam, Rodrigo, and Charlie for contributing to this episode. Please stay tuned for subsequent episodes of this season focused on New Guinea, in which we explore activist and conservation efforts, the latest science, investigations, and infrastructure projects impacting the island. The podcast introduction and closing soundscape is from the Adalbert Mountains in Papua New Guinea. Credit to the communities of Musiamunat, Yavera, and Iwarame, the Nature Conservancy, and Zuzana Baravalova. Mongabay Explores is an ongoing podcast series diving into environmental stories from around the globe. Be sure to check out the previous 2 seasons of this podcast, which explored North American salamander biodiversity in the face of a pandemic, and also our 10-part series on the island of Sumatra. If you enjoyed this show, please tell a friend. That is the best way to help expand our reach and keep growing. Please subscribe to the Mongabay Explores podcast wherever you get podcasts. Watch for a new edition which is published every 2 weeks. Special projects like this are made possible by our Patreon supporters, so please consider becoming a monthly sponsor via our Patreon page at patreon.com/Mongabay. Just $1 per month will help us offset the costs and hosting fees. Keep up with all of Mongabay's news from Nature's Frontline at mongabay.com or get updates via Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok, where our handle is at Mongabay. Thank you once again, and we'll be back soon with another episode of Mongabay Explores.